Okay, Alexander, let's revisit what's going on with energy, gas, oil, and inflation in the Biden White House. It looks like Biden is now going to more countries to ask them to help out in order to get some oil into the market, and in his view, to bring down inflation. That's his overall strategy. The Biden White House's overall strategy. So it's not only now OPEC, OPEC plus. It's China, it's India. He's trying to find oil under the sofa cushions. It appears he's trying to find oil and gas under the sofa cushions, which is really interesting because the U.S. has got a ton of oil and gas. But I guess when you keep on closing pipelines, it doesn't help out too much. But anyway, what's going on here?
Well, exactly. That's exactly what's going on now. I did a program a couple of days ago on my channel in which I said that the US is now outreaching to China to try to get the Chinese to release oil from their reserves. And we've now had it confirmed that the US is actually talking to many countries, to be precise, to China, to India, and to Japan, to try to get all these three countries to join the US in a intervention on the oil market, simultaneously releasing reserves onto the oil market in order to depress prices. And the reason that the administration is doing that is because they're getting very concerned that rising energy costs are adding to the inflation problem, which we've discussed the causes of many times. And they are, I think, especially worried that there's a major problem with energy this winter. So they're doing everything they possibly can to get all four of these countries, or all three of these countries, to agree. Now, Japan will probably go along because Japan is a close ally of the United States. India will probably go along. The Chinese are said to be discussing this matter between themselves. They're not yet sure whether they will or they won't. They want concessions from the US on all sorts of political topics in return. So it's not clear that the Chinese will necessarily agree, but let's assume they do. Let's assume everybody does. Let's assume that there is a concerted release of a large amount of oil from the reserves into the global market for oil. What that tends to do is, yes, it does reduce prices for a while. And we will see a dip in prices, in energy prices, or at least in oil prices, in the run-up to Christmas, which is probably, I guess, what the administration is concerned about. But the lesson of these things is that it's like drinking a glass of water when you're thirsty. If you drink a glass of water, you assuage your thirst, but sooner or later your thirst comes back, and you need to drink another glass of water. You can't deal with this problem of rising energy prices by releasing from your reserves all the time. If you do that, eventually your reserves will run out. You have to eventually put in place policies that will cause the market itself, the oil market, to self-correct downwards and to take the pressure of rising prices away. And unfortunately for the Biden administration, it shows no sign of any willingness to do that. It's still putting its foot down on the monetary accelerator, which, as I've said, is the major upward driver, the single fact that's driving all prices, including oil prices, up. But on top of that, we now have a situation where the Europeans are going into another lockdown cycle, which is going to disrupt supply chains even more. And whilst that, in the short term, is also going to add downward pressure on oil prices, in the long term, by disrupting supply chains even further, it's probably going to mean that inflation in general is going to go on rising, and with it, eventually, oil prices. So we could have a brief downward dip in oil prices this winter, but one which won't last, and we could start to see oil prices start rising again in the spring.
Biden's Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm said, quote, "We're working through an energy transition, and we've got to start by adding energy. And the reality is we have to take some time to get off of oil and gas. We recognize this. This is a transition." This is a direct quote from her just the other day, like a day or two ago. The EU is locking down. I'm sure every country is going to follow the Austrian model and impose some sort of lockdown in one form or another, which will last for a long, long time. It probably won't end until the people actually do something about it. Rolling lockdowns, we've predicted this for a while now. You have Biden purposefully closing down pipelines. I mean, he's doing it on purpose. He's closed down Keystone the first day on his job. He's thinking of closing down, I believe it's called Line 5, which runs from, I believe it's Ontario, if I'm not mistaken, down to the U.S. Don't look at what they say, look at what they do. In this case with Biden, look at what they say and look at what they do, because it's crystal clear whether you're looking at Europe or the U.S. Can we just say that their goal is to transition from oil and gas? Can we just come out and say it? The European Union and the United States, their religion is the climate, and their goal is to transition away from oil and gas. Period. It doesn't matter what jobs are lost, what industry closes, and where the inflation is. The only reason they want to bring down the inflation is for political purposes, short term, not for the long term health of the country. I mean, this is the reality. This is where they want to go.
Well, period. It is the reality, but it's also a reality that exposes the ultimate unreality. Because what the Energy Secretary is saying is, yes, our ultimate plan is to do away with fossil fuels, and we're going to go on closing down pipelines, stopping drilling, doing all the kind of things that we're doing, putting pressure on all sorts of countries around the world to move away from fossil fuels. That's our plan, because we're concerned about the climate, and that's our intention. And that's the drive, that's if you like, the ideological mission, that's the objective. At the same time, what she is finding, what the administration is finding, is that they're running up constantly against the underlying supply and political realities. Because for the administration to carry out this giant project of transitioning entirely to a non-carbon future, something, by the way, which is probably unattainable, at least that's my opinion, with current technologies, but that's another story. For the administration to achieve that, it needs to be in office, or at least in power. And in order to be in power, at least in the United States, for the moment, it needs to win elections. And it can't realistically hope to win elections if prices are surging and people feel their living standards are being hammered downward. So it is caught in a trap. On the one hand, ideologically, it must persist in closing down pipelines, stopping drilling, persuading countries to move away from fossil fuels. At the same time, it needs to bring inflation under control in order to win that election, or at least hold their position in that election in 2022. So they're rushing around calling on the OPEC producers and Russia to increase oil production, and they're talking to countries like China, India, Japan to try to get them to release oil from their oil reserves. So in a way, you see how the objective is now running against the reality. Not so much an economic reality, because to be straightforward about it, these people don't do economics, but against the political reality, which they understand very well. The president's polling numbers are collapsing. This vice president's polling numbers are collapsing. It's increasingly looking like a rout in the midterms in 2022. You have got to bring inflation under control. So that means you've got to do something about energy costs. That means more oil, more fossil fuels, not less. And it means getting OPEC to increase its production, increase its output, and it means getting countries like China, India, and Japan to join the United States to release oil from their strategic reserves. So it's this dilemma, which we're going to see more and more of. It's going to get worse between the ideology, the ideological imperative, and the practical political electoral reality. I'm going to just add one other thing, which is there's a lot of talk now about war in Ukraine and about the possibility of a war in Ukraine. Risk of that, I think, is my own personal view, is that the risk of that is starting to fade. The reason I think it's starting to fade is because the administration doesn't want a war in Ukraine, which might lead to sanctions, might force it to impose sanctions, which could end up stopping Russia's gas, oil exports to Europe and to North America, which would, of course, immediately result in a further big upward surge in oil and energy prices. So we have this situation where, on the one hand, the administration wants to reduce prices. On the other hand, it's insisting on increasing them.
All right, but that's just, they're just doing this. Once again, this is short term. That's my point on all of this. Biden is just looking for a short-term fix. The globalist agenda is just looking for a short-term fix for the midterms. Maybe their calculus is if we can bring inflation down for the next year and change, then we could manage to at least win one of the chambers. Maybe we can keep the House or keep the Senate or something like that. Maybe their thinking there is they'll bring inflation down to minimize the damage. Come midterms, that's my point. This is completely a short-term Band-Aid here. Why would Putin and OPEC go along with this? I mean, why would China go along with this? Why would India go along with this?
Well, they might not,
unless they're part of the game.
That's firstly. I mean, they might not, but I mean,
Putin. Just real quick, Putin has made some very alarming climate statements. The past couple of weeks, which really, I don't know, very bizarre statements. Anyway.
Well, I mean, they might. I don't think the Russians are going to cut oil production. I mean, I think they've basically ruled that out for them. Rather, increased oil production. I think they basically ruled that out. And of course, as we see, there are major supply constraints on natural gas, Russian national gas, to Europe. So I don't think the Russians are going to increase oil production. OPEC has also ruled it out. In fact, if anything, they seem to be cutting oil production at the moment. So I don't think you're going to get a huge amount of relief from that quarter. I think it's much more likely that the Chinese, the Indians, and the Japanese will agree to release reserves, some of their reserves, because they're all industrial economies, manufacturing economies, as China and Japan especially so, and export economies. And of course, from their point of view, reducing energy costs, even if only for a short time, actually helps them economically. So for that reason, they might do it. The Chinese are also saying that they want political concessions in return. So they might do it. But your underlying point, your fundamental point, that the administration is not retreating from its ideological objective, is spot on. So what you're going to get over the next few years is this constant stop-go, because on the one hand, they will want to persist with their ideological objective of moving towards a carbon-free future. On the other, at the same time, they're always going to run up, it seems to me, against these electoral problems. Now, it might help them. Releasing petroleum, the oil from the reserves, might bring down the oil price for a couple of months. It might help them a little through the midterms. Doubt it'll make much difference. That's my own personal view, but it might do. But after that, you get 2024. So how long can you keep on doing this? Because the reality is, and I think this has been the big lesson of 2021, the alternative forms of energy production that we've been hearing so much about just don't work efficiently or smoothly in a crisis. You can't rebuild your entire energy system around them. So once again, you have your ideology colliding with reality. And you can press on with the one, you can press on with the ideology if you like, but ultimately it will always cut against you, and you will always find that you're pulled back into doing things which are inconsistent with what your ideology tells you should do. By the way, if you follow the story of the Soviet Union, you find that the Russians at that time, the Soviets, used to run into that same problem all the time. Their ideology pointed in one direction, the underlying economic realities pointed in the other, and there was constantly a seesaw between the two as they tried to reconcile the two, and in the end never could.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was a different time as well. And you look at the world today, and their patrons, the politicians, the people that fill their coffers, and the people that they answer to are not the people 20, 30 years ago that were the oligarchs, the industrialists, the people that were in the energy sector, and in these types of sectors. Now the oligarchs are the Zuckerbergs and the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos, and people that are in the information technology space, or in the case of Elon Musk, in the computerized car space, which is pretty much what a Tesla is, just a computer on wheels. But, these are the people that they answer to now. They don't have to answer to the Exxons and the BPs and the Shell Oils. They want to get rid of these people. They've forgotten about these people. So, to me, the underlying issue here is that who cares about inflation for these people? These people are like, who cares about inflation? The Bidens, the van der Leyens, the Klaus Schwabs, all these people, the Elon Musks, the Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg wants you to stay home. It's more money for them. If there's one thing the lockdowns have shown us is that these guys become much richer when people are locked up in their homes than when people are out and about. So for them, it's, who cares about inflation? It actually helps us. It helps us in the way we manage money and our debts. And it keeps people home, which is a plus for them.
Yeah.
And Europe doesn't have a problem because the EU says we don't have to think about elections because we're not a democratic union anyway. Yeah. And the people are going to do whatever we tell them to do because they don't have a choice. We're the EU. We're this new form of Politburo communism, neoliberal communism. So they don't have to worry about the election puzzle. The problem is the United States of America, which does have elections. And for them, that's a problem. They don't care about inflation. They couldn't give one iota care about inflation. For them, the problem is the impact it has on our election. That is the issue. Europe, they couldn't give a crap. The United States, they have to figure out a way. How do we solve this election problem? Because if they didn't have this election problem, then we would be moving through this energy transition full speed ahead. They don't care if the inflation was at 8, 20, 50, 100%. Stay at home, everybody.
Yes.
Stay at home and order your Uber Eats and just be quiet. That and put on your virtual reality goggles. That is the plan.
Always remember, though, that, oligarchs are only oligarchs because of the money they control. And, of course, money that they control is, inflation is the devaluation of money. If it gets out of control, if we get into a 100% annualized inflation rate, which is basically teetering there on the brink of hyperinflation, they're going to be as affected as everybody else. So they can't let the whole thing get completely out of control. But yes, let's agree with you that they do a certain amount of inflation. Let's say 10, 15% inflation. They can manage it. If you are a tech oligarch, it's not really a problem for you. You don't operate in the way of the sort of heavy goods that the old-style industrialists did and the old-style financial system serviced. You don't worry about that to the same extent. But, of course, you do come up against the fact that your customer base is being squeezed. So that's one problem. but also you come up against the elections. And of course, in the United States, as you rightly say, because the United States is a nation constructed around its constitution, and it's the political system that constitution gave rise to, it's very, very difficult to find a way round that. Now, what you could do is you could try to evolve the United States into a direction of something more like Europe, where things are appointed as opposed to where people are elected. That would be a fundamental change, such a fundamental change in American society, that I wonder how viable that operation would be.
They're trying.
But if I can say something,
They're trying.
If I can say something, that might be the great plan. But as I said, it would be such a radical and complete restructuring of American society that, to me, it also looks utopian in the end. I think it's utopian even in European terms too. I mean, there's opposition now in Europe at a popular level in many places. I think in the United States there would be far more, and I think ultimately this whole thing would just crumble and crack and break down. But that's the long-term problem. The short-term problem is that they're not going to be able to move towards this appointed system, if you like, in the United States before the midterms in 2022. So their objective at the moment is holding their position in the midterms, preventing a Republican sweep. That's the overriding imperative at the present time. And that's why they're doing the opposite things to the ones that they said they would do. They're trying to get the oil released from the reserves. They're trying to get OPEC and Russia to increase their production. It's a classic thing. There was a book by the writer Arthur Koestler who once explained the trap ideologues fall into, and he spoke about the law of perpetual detours. You have your objective in the distance, but reality forces you to undertake detours. You can't move to your objective in a straight line. There's always that election you have to pass. There's always this strike you have to deal with. There's always, the supply chain problems. So you always have to sort of detour. And even though your objective is always there, you never can quite get onto the path which will eventually lead you to reach it. And that is the trap that all systems that are based on ideologies fall into in the end.
Yeah, well, their stumbling block is the U.S. Constitution.
Absolutely, with that,
and the United States.
And
I think Europe is kind of figuring it out. Yeah, we do have protests here and there, but you could tell the European leaders they don't care. They really don't care how many people are in the streets. I mean, Rutte is arresting people in the Netherlands. They don't care. They don't care.
Well, absolutely.
So
but
the stumbling block is the U.S. Constitution, is the United States of America. And you said the key word is restructure society, which is exactly what they have been doing and are trying to do. Restructure the American society in order to go along with a European type of model.
I mean, always bear in mind, though, that even in Europe, we are still at a very, very early stage in this experiment, if you like. So, I mean, the resistance isn't properly organised yet. They're moving fast.
We are at an early stage, but we are moving really
I know, but we
terrifyingly fast.
People always move fast, but as I said, don't assume, as I said, that this is not going to encounter a lot more resistance further down the line. I mean, don't write off people in Europe either. But in the United States, the Constitution remains a gigantic obstacle and very difficult to work your way round. And, of course, there's a part of the political class, there's the Republicans, who might go along with some of what you want, but ultimately they don't see why they shouldn't be in charge instead of you. So there's always that tension. So, whatever restructuring they achieve, realistically, they're not going to achieve it before the midterms. And that's the problem that they face at the moment. And that's why they're having to do the opposite of what they said they would do. Even the Soviet Union, which had far more control over its society than any Western country does today, they also found that they got trapped into the law of perpetual detours, because they found that they still had to make compromises and take detours with their project simply in order to retain control. And I suspect that's going to be the long-term problem. And I suspect it's going to be the long-term escalating problem. But in the meantime, they're having to take a whopping big detour at the moment because the inflation is turning out different from what they expected, and they have to release oil and onto the markets and get oil production increased, because at the moment they've got this little problem of the midterms coming up in a few months. And what else can they realistically do?
No, yeah. I mean, they are looking for a short-term fix to somehow patch up the midterms. That's exactly what they're trying to do. And you're right. The big stumbling block is, how do you get around the Constitution? It's massive. How do you implement this new plan, this Build Back Better, Green New World, with the Constitution in your way? And that is why the plan is just, you know what? We're not going to find a way to get around the Constitution. We're not going to be able to create enough detours to get around the Constitution. So what do they say? Well, if you can't get around the Constitution, let's just, blow the whole thing up. Let's tear it up and just make a beeline straight to our new utopia. That is exactly their thinking. They figured out they can't get around the Constitution. I really believe they figured it out. We can't get around this thing. It is so well written and so rock solid that the only way around this is to just tear the thing up and start new.
Blow it up, and you blow up the United States. Can I simply say it straightforward?
I agree, but they don't think like. My point is, they're not thinking like that.
I agree.
We've seen what they've done to other countries.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But as I said, I mean, and if that happens, then to be very, very clear, the whole thing unravels very, very, very fast, because. Again, let me reiterate a point I've made many times before. The United States exists because of its constitution. It is the only country in the world that was created around the constitutional settlement that was put together by the founders in the 1780s. Do away with it, and the whole structure of the United States breaks down.
Yeah, when you look at the big picture to all of this, we've talked about many countries that may buck the trend, that may resist. We've said Russia might. I think that's out the window now. We've pointed to other countries. Switzerland's going to be having a vote on stuff, and we've said, maybe Serbia is different because it's not in the EU but in Europe. We've pointed to different countries, and every country seems to be going down the same route. At the end of the day, the one country that's going to need to hold the line is going to have to be the United States. It is the only country I can see in the grand scheme of things that can stop this plan. I mean, I can't think of another place that can stop this transition and this whole, crazy utopia thinking.
I mean, bear in mind, however, when you talk about China and Russia, I mean, they have their own agendas, but they also have there is a geopolitical conflict and fault line there, and it is a real one. I mean, that's not theatre or imagination. But I agree. If you're talking about the West, and it's the West which is driving all this, then it is the United States, where there's both the greatest degree of political organisation and the greatest degree of self-confidence, but also the major constitutional and institutional constraints, which, as I said, stand in the way. Yeah,
we'll leave it there. I'm sure these people are just pulling their hairs. I'm sure like the Klaus Schwabs of the world are like pulling their hair going, God, this U.S. Constitution, it's too damn well written. I'm positive of it. They're like, what do we do?
Well...
they're even going to run Joe Biden in 2024. That's how desperate they are.
Well. What at the moment, it's not as if they seem to have much alternative, given the caliber of the vice president. But that's a discussion, I think, for another day.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com and the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code REALNEWS. Take care.